12 years ago, the USS Meridian vanished from the edge of known space and took with it 247 souls who had families waiting for them back on Earth. Captain Daniel Hayes had been sitting in his command chair when the sensors picked up something strange near the outer rim. He ordered his crew to investigate because that was what explorers did. They flew toward the unknown and tried to understand it. No one could have guessed that the unknown would swallow them whole. The ship had been on a routine survey mission. Nothing about that day suggested danger. The crew had eaten breakfast together in the mess hall. Lieutenant Amy Tran had joked about her terrible coffee. Chief Engineer Cole had complained about a faulty power coupling that kept him up all night. Dr. Park had been excited about some unusual radiation readings from a nearby asteroid field. It was an ordinary morning on an extraordinary ship, and then everything changed in the span of a heartbeat. A light appeared in front of the Meridian. It was not a star or a planet or anything the sensors could identify. It simply existed where nothing had existed before, and it pulled the ship forward with a force that no engine could resist. Captain Hayes gave the order to reverse thrust, but the Meridian kept moving toward the light. He told his crew to hold on. He told them they would find a way through this. And then the light swallowed them, and Earth never heard from the Meridian again. The search lasted for 3 years. Every ship that could be spared flew to the outer rim and scanned every inch of space where the Meridian had disappeared. They found nothing. No debris, no distress beacon, no trace that the ship had ever existed at all. The families held vigils and prayer services. The government built a memorial on the steps of Fleet Command with 247 names carved into black stone. People cried and grieved, and eventually accepted that the Meridian was gone forever. Humanity changed after that day. The loss of the Meridian reminded everyone how dangerous space could be. The government pulled back its exploration programs and focused on protecting what they already had. New colonies stopped being built. Old colonies received better defenses. People looked at the stars with fear instead of wonder, and the dream of reaching the farthest corners of the galaxy faded into memory. Then the Dominion came. They arrived 5 years after the Meridian disappeared, emerging from a region of space that humans had never explored. The Dominion was not a single species, but a coalition of 17 different alien races that had joined together under one banner. They controlled thousands of star systems and commanded a fleet so vast that human sensors could not count all the ships. Their technology made Earth's best weapons look like toys, and their message was simple. They wanted to expand into human territory, and they expected humanity to step aside. Admiral Lane led the defense preparations from Fleet Command. She was a tall woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen too many battles. She studied the reports about Dominion strength and ran simulation after simulation on her computer. Every scenario ended the same way. Earth had 43 combat-ready vessels. The Dominion had over 8,000. If war came, humanity would last 6 months at most before complete extinction. The Dominion sent an ambassador named to deliver their terms. He was a tall creature with blue-gray skin and eyes that never seemed to blink. He spoke perfect English in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. He told Admiral Lane that humanity had 90 days to surrender all colonies beyond the solar system. If they refused, the Dominion would take those colonies by force, and they would not stop until Earth itself was nothing but ash and memory. Admiral Lane listened to his words and felt the weight of 8 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders. She knew she could not win a war against the Dominion. She also knew she could not simply surrender and condemn humanity to servitude under alien rule. She needed a miracle, and miracles were in short supply. The answer came on a Tuesday morning when the sky above Earth split open, and something impossible fell through. A ship emerged from fold space directly above the planet. Its hull was scorched and covered with strange patterns that seemed to move when people looked at them. The shape was wrong, twisted, and modified in ways that should not have been possible. But the transponder code that broadcast from its communication array was unmistakable. It was a code that had been silent for 12 years. It belonged to the USS Meridian. Admiral Lane scrambled every fighter in orbit to intercept the vessel. She did not know if this was a trick or a trap or something worse. She stood in the command center and watched the screens as her pilots surrounded the battered ship and demanded identification. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came through the speakers, and Lane felt her heart stop in her chest. Captain Daniel Hayes spoke slowly and clearly. His voice was older and more tired than she remembered, but there was no mistaking who it was. He said that the Meridian had returned after a very long journey. He said that his crew had found something in the depths of space, something that could change the fate of humanity forever. He requested permission to dock at Orbital Station 7 and speak with the Admiralty in person. He promised that everything would be explained. Admiral Lane granted permission because she had no other choice. She watched the Meridian limp toward the station with its escort of fighters and wondered what could possibly have kept that ship alive for 12 years in the void between stars. She wondered what Daniel Hayes had found out there in the darkness. She wondered if she should be relieved or terrified. The Meridian docked under heavy guard. Security teams lined the corridors with weapons drawn. Medical staff waited with stretchers and scanners. Everyone held their breath as the airlock cycled open and the first figures stepped through. Only 91 people walked off that ship, less than half the crew that had departed 12 years ago. They looked older than they should have, worn down by years of hardship that no one on Earth could imagine. Captain Daniel Hayes came last, leaning on a cane with one hand and carrying a small metal case in the other. His hair had turned completely gray, and deep lines marked his face like scars. He looked at Admiral Lane and managed a tired smile. He told her that they had brought something home, something that should not exist, something that could save them all or destroy everything. The war with the Dominion was about to change forever. The survivors of the Meridian were taken to a secure medical facility where doctors examined them for hours. They found no alien parasites or mind-control devices or anything else that might explain how 91 people had survived 12 years in the unknown reaches of space. The crew was tired and malnourished and carrying scars both visible and hidden, but they were human. They were real. They had somehow made it home. Captain Daniel Hayes refused medical treatment until he could speak with Admiral Lane. He sat in a small conference room with guards at every door, and the metal case resting on the table in front of him. His first officer, Commander Lisa Morgan, sat beside him with her arms crossed and her eyes watching everything. She had been a young lieutenant when the Meridian disappeared. Now she was a hardened soldier who had seen things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Admiral Lane entered the room with 3 other admirals and a civilian advisor from the government. She sat across from Hayes and told him to start from the beginning. She wanted to know everything. Hayes nodded slowly and began to tell a story that would change the course of human history. The light that pulled the Meridian from normal space was not a natural phenomenon. It was an artificial wormhole created by technology so advanced that it made human science look like cave paintings. The ship traveled through that wormhole for what felt like seconds but was actually weeks. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in a galaxy so far from Earth that the light from human stars had not yet reached it. They were alone in a place where no human had ever been, surrounded by dead worlds and ancient ruins. Hayes called the builders of those ruins the architects. His crew found no living trace of them, but they left behind evidence of a civilization that had spanned millions of years. The architects had built cities on 1,000 worlds. They had shaped stars and moved planets and created wonders that human minds could barely comprehend. And then, for reasons the crew never fully understood, they had vanished. Every world they touched was empty. Every city was silent. Only their machines remained, waiting in the darkness for someone to find them. Dr. Park had been the one to unlock the secrets of the architects. He spent years studying their language and their technology with nothing but determination and a desperate need to find a way home. He learned that the architects had created something they called the fold engine. It was not just a device for traveling through space. It was a machine that could bend reality itself, folding the fabric of existence like paper and reshaping it according to the will of whoever controlled it. The fold engine could create matter from nothing. It could compress time within a localized field. It could generate energy beyond anything human reactors could produce. The architects had used it to terraform worlds in days and build structures that would have taken ordinary civilizations centuries to complete. They had become gods of their own making. But they had also used it as a weapon. Hayes opened the metal case and revealed a small crystalline object that pulsed with soft blue light. It was about the size of a human fist, covered with the same geometric patterns that now decorated the Meridian's hull. This was the control interface for the fold engine. The actual device was much larger and remained aboard the ship, integrated into its systems in ways that the crew had spent years perfecting. Admiral Lane stared at the crystal and asked the obvious question. If the architects were so powerful, what happened to them? Why were all their worlds empty? Commander Lisa Morgan answered that question with a voice that carried the weight of personal loss. The architects destroyed themselves. They used the fold engine against each other in wars that tore apart entire star systems. They folded planets out of existence and erased whole species from reality. They became so powerful that they forgot how to fear their own creation, and that creation eventually consumed them. The warnings they left behind were clear. The fold engine was the greatest gift and the greatest curse ever created. Those who used it for war would follow the architects into oblivion. The room fell silent. Admiral Lane looked at the crystal and thought about the Dominion fleet massing at the border. She thought about the ultimatum and the 90 days counting down toward extinction. She had prayed for a miracle, and now one sat on the table in front of her, glowing with the light of a dead civilization. Hayes explained that the crew had debated what to do for years. Some wanted to destroy the fold engine and spend their remaining days in peace among the ruins. Others wanted to use it themselves, to carve out a safe haven far from both Earth and the Dominion. A faction believed they had no right to make such a decision and should bring the device home regardless of the consequences. They voted 3 times over the course of 5 years. The first vote was inconclusive. The second nearly tore the crew apart. The third came after they detected signals from the direction of Earth, signals that spoke of war and fear and a threat called the Dominion. That vote was decisive. They would return home and give humanity the choice that had been to them. Hayes leaned forward and looked directly into Admiral Lane's eyes. He told her that the fold engine could end the war before it began. A single demonstration of its power would make the Dominion understand that they could not win. But he also told her that every civilization that used the device for warfare eventually turned it against themselves. The architects were proof of that. So were dozens of other species whose ruins the crew had discovered during their years of exploration. He placed the crystal back in its case and slid it across the table. The decision, he said, belonged to Earth now. He had carried this burden for 12 years. He had lost over 150 crew members to accidents and despair and the simple cruelty of time. He had done his duty by bringing the fold engine home. What happened next was not his choice to make. Admiral Lane picked up the case and felt the crystal humming against her palms. She thought about her own children and she thought about the billions of people on Earth who were counting on her to protect them. She thought about the architects who had held this same power and used it to erase themselves from existence. She thanked Captain Hayes for his service and his sacrifice. She told him that his crew would be treated as heroes regardless of what decision the government made. She promised that their story would be told and their lost companions would be remembered. Then she walked out of the room with the crystal in her hands and the fate of humanity resting on her shoulders. The countdown to the Dominion's deadline continued. 72 days remained. The news of the Meridian's return spread across Earth within hours. People gathered in the streets and watched the broadcasts with tears in their eyes. Families who had mourned for 12 years learned that their loved ones were alive. Children who had grown up without parents suddenly had the chance to meet them again. It should have been a moment of pure joy, but the shadow of the Dominion threat hung over everything like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Dr. Park stood before a room full of scientists and military officers and tried to explain something that explanation. He had spent 12 years studying the fold engine, and he still did not fully understand how it worked. The device operated on principles that contradicted everything human physics had established. It treated the laws of nature as suggestions rather than rules. It could do things that should have been impossible, and it did them with an ease that made Park uncomfortable. He showed them recordings from the Meridian's journey, stars being reshaped by invisible hands, planets disappearing and reappearing in different locations, time flowing at different speeds in different places. The architects had used the fold engine to perform miracles on a scale that human imagination could barely grasp. They had been masters of reality itself. Then he showed them the ruins. World after world, empty and silent. Cities that had stood for millions of years, now crumbling into dust. The architects had left behind monuments to their own destruction. Park had found records of their final wars, conflicts that made human battles look like playground fights. They had folded entire star systems into oblivion. They had erased species from the fabric of existence. They had become so drunk on their own power that they could not stop using it, even when the end was clearly coming. The presentation ended with a simple question on the screen: what will humanity do? Admiral Lane called a meeting of the highest levels of government. Presidents and prime ministers and generals gathered in a secure bunker beneath Fleet Command. They argued for hours about what to do with the fold engine. Some demanded that it be used immediately against the Dominion. They said humanity had a right to survive and would use whatever tools were available to ensure that survival. Others wanted the device destroyed before it could tempt anyone into misusing it. They pointed to the architects as proof that such power always corrupted those who wielded it. A third group suggested a middle path. They wanted to study the fold engine further and develop safeguards before making any decisions about its use. They argued that humanity was different from the architects. Humans had learned from their own history of nuclear weapons. They had created treaties and oversight bodies to prevent catastrophic misuse. Perhaps the same approach could work with the fold engine. Commander Lisa Morgan addressed the assembly and shared her own experiences. She had watched her crew tear itself apart over this very question. She had seen friendships of 20 years dissolve into bitter arguments. She had buried colleagues who could not bear the weight of carrying such responsibility. The fold engine was not just a technological challenge. It was a moral test that would determine what kind of species humanity truly was. She told them about a man named Greg who had served as the Meridian's chief of security. He had argued passionately for destroying the device and had almost succeeded in convincing the crew to do exactly that. But in the end, he had voted to bring it home. When Morgan asked him why he changed his mind, he had given her an answer she never forgot. He said that running from power was just as dangerous as abusing it. Humanity needed to face this choice with open eyes and make a decision together. Hiding from the truth would not make the truth go away. Had died 3 years before the Meridian returned to Earth. A hull breach during a salvage operation had taken him and 4 others. Morgan told the assembly that she carried his words with her every day. She believed that humanity could be better than the architects, but only if they chose to be. That choice required honesty and transparency, and a willingness to accept responsibility for whatever came next. Ambassador learned of the Meridian's return through his network of informants. He sent an urgent message to the Dominion leadership and requested new instructions. The response came within hours. The Dominion knew about the architects. Their own legends spoke of the ancient ones who had reshaped galaxies and then vanished in fire and silence. The thought that humans had recovered architect technology terrified them more than any fleet of warships ever could. visited Admiral Lane in her office and spoke with unusual honesty. He told her that the Dominion had expanded for thousands of years without encountering serious resistance. They had absorbed weaker species and crushed those who fought back, but they had always avoided certain regions of space, places where the architects had once walked. Those regions were cursed, according to Dominion belief. Anyone who took from them would suffer the same fate as the Ancient Ones. He asked Lane directly if the rumors were true. Had the Meridian brought back an architect device? Lane refused to confirm or deny anything, but her silence told everything he needed to know. He left her office with fear written plainly on his alien features. The Dominion fleet at the border began moving again, not advancing but repositioning. They were preparing for something, though no one on Earth could say exactly what. The countdown continued. 60 days remained before the ultimatum expired. Captain Hayes spent his time visiting the families of crew members who had not survived the journey. He sat with parents who had lost children and children who had lost parents. He told them stories about their loved ones and how they had lived and what they had contributed during the long years in exile. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he owed them that much. He owed them the truth about how their families had died so that others might have a chance to live. At night, he stood on the observation deck of Orbital Station 7 and watched Earth turning slowly beneath him. He wondered if he had made the right choice in bringing the Fold engine home. He wondered if humanity would prove worthy of the trust he had placed in them. He wondered what the architects would think if they could see what their creation might become. The stars offered no answers. They simply watched and waited as they always had. The Dominion did not wait for the original deadline to expire. Ambassador appeared at Fleet Command with a new ultimatum and a new expression on his alien face. He no longer spoke with the casual arrogance that had marked his previous visits. His voice carried something that humans recognized immediately. It was fear, pure and undisguised fear. He told Admiral Lane that the Dominion Council had reviewed the situation and reached a new decision. Humanity had 72 hours to surrender the architect device, not the colonies, not the outer territories, just the device. If they refused, the Dominion fleet would attack immediately with every ship at their disposal. There would be no negotiations. There would be no mercy. Earth would burn until nothing remained but ash and silence. Lane asked him why the Dominion was so afraid, told her that his people had memories stretching back tens of thousands of years. They remembered the architects. They remembered what happened to species that tried to use architect technology. The Ancient Ones had been gods, and their fall had shattered entire galaxies. The Dominion would not allow humanity to follow that path. They would destroy Earth 1,000 times over before they let another species gain that kind of power. The message was clear: surrender the Fold engine or face extinction. Captain Hayes gathered his surviving crew and asked for volunteers. He told them that he had a plan, but it was dangerous and there was no guarantee it would work. He wanted to demonstrate the power of the Fold engine in a way that would make the Dominion understand they could not win. Not an attack, not destruction. Just a display so overwhelming that even the proudest alien admiral would have to acknowledge the truth. Every single survivor volunteered. They had spent 12 years carrying this burden across the stars. They were not going to let it end with the destruction of their home world. The Meridian departed from Orbital Station 7 with a skeleton crew of 30 volunteers. Captain Hayes sat in his command chair with the same tired determination that had kept him going for over a decade. Commander Lisa Morgan stood at the tactical station, watching the Dominion scouts that shadowed their movement. Lieutenant Amy Tran guided the ship through the outer solar system with the skill that had saved their lives more times than anyone could count. Dr. Park prepared the Fold engine for its first full activation, since they had left the architect ruins. Chief Engineer Cole moved through the ship like a man possessed. He checked every system and every connection and every backup plan he could think of. The Meridian had been modified so heavily that it barely resembled the vessel that had left Earth 12 years ago. Strange alloys covered the hull. Alien circuitry ran through the walls. The fold engine sat at the heart of the ship like a sleeping giant waiting to wake up. They reached the outer edge of the solar system, where Neptune's moons drifted in cold darkness. Hayes had chosen one of the smallest moons for the demonstration. It was barely 50 kilometers across, a frozen rock with no life and no value except as a target. The Dominion scouts watched from a safe distance, recording everything for their masters. Dr. Park activated the fold engine. The ship hummed with power that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The geometric patterns on the hull began to glow with soft blue light. Reality itself seemed to bend around the meridian as the device drew energy from sources that human science could not explain. Park's hands moved across controls that he had spent years learning to understand. His voice was steady as he reported each step of the activation sequence. Hayes gave the order to proceed. The smallest moon of Neptune simply stopped existing. There was no explosion, no debris, no trace that anything had ever been there. The fold engine reached out across the void and folded that tiny world into a dimensional pocket that existed outside normal space. One moment the moon was there. The next moment it was gone. The energy readings were broadcast on all frequencies so that every ship in the system could witness what had happened. The Dominion scouts went silent. Their sensors had recorded everything, and they had no explanation for what they had just seen. Technology that could erase a moon from existence without any visible effect was beyond anything their civilization possessed. It was beyond anything any civilization possessed except the ancient ones who had died millions of years before the Dominion was born. Admiral Lane received a transmission from the Dominion flagship within the hour. The fleet had stopped its advance. They were holding position at the border and requesting communication with Earth's leadership. Ambassador appeared on the screen with an expression that mixed terror and reluctant respect. He told Lane that the Dominion would withdraw from human territory immediately. They would recognize Earth's sovereignty over all its current colonies and would not make any further demands. But they had one condition. Humanity must agree to never use the fold engine offensively against any species. If they broke this agreement, every civilization in the known galaxy would unite against them. Not because they were allies, not because they liked each other, simply because survival demanded it. Explained that the Dominion had legends about the architects that humans did not know. The ancient ones had not destroyed themselves alone. They had dragged dozens of younger species into their wars. They had used the fold engine to erase entire civilizations that had nothing to do with their conflicts. The galaxy had barely survived their fall. No one wanted to see such power unleashed again. He asked Lane a simple question. Could humanity be trusted with the fate of every living being in the universe? Lane looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. She told that she did not know. Humanity had done terrible things throughout its history. They had built weapons capable of destroying their own world and had come close to using them more than once. But they had also learned from their mistakes. They had created systems to prevent the worst impulses from winning. They had chosen restraint when easier paths were available. She promised that Earth would consider the Dominion's terms carefully. She could not make guarantees for all of humanity, but she could promise that the decision would not be made lightly. Accepted her answer and ended the transmission. The Dominion fleet remained at the border, waiting to see what humanity would choose. The clock was still ticking, but the countdown had changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about what kind of future humanity wanted to build. The United Earth Council gathered in the Great Assembly Hall with representatives from every nation on the planet. The chamber was filled with presidents and prime ministers and ambassadors who carried the weight of 8 billion lives on their shoulders. They had come to make the most important decision in human history. Outside the building, crowds filled the streets of every major city. People watched on screens and held their breath and waited to learn what their future would look like. Captain Daniel Hayes stood at the podium and looked out at the faces before him. He had never been comfortable with speeches, but he understood that this moment required words that would echo through the centuries. He began by talking about the crew members who had not survived the journey home. He spoke their names slowly and carefully, giving each one the weight it deserved. 156 people had died so that the Fold engine could reach Earth. Their sacrifice demanded that humanity make this choice with open eyes and honest hearts. He told the council about the years of debate aboard the Meridian. He described the arguments that had torn friendships apart and the sleepless nights spent wondering if they were doing the right thing. He admitted that he had considered destroying the Fold engine himself on more than one occasion. The temptation to remove the burden entirely had been almost overwhelming, but running from power was just as dangerous as abusing it. Humanity needed to face this choice and make a decision together. Hayes stepped back from the podium and let others speak. Commander Lisa Morgan argued for keeping the Fold engine as a deterrent, but placing it under strict international oversight. She pointed to the architects as proof of what happened when such power was held by a single authority without accountability. They had used their creation alone, in secret, without anyone to question their decisions. Humanity had a chance to do better. They could build systems that required cooperation and consensus before the device could ever be used again. Dr. Park suggested a specific framework. The Fold engine would be placed under the control of a new organization called the Architects Trust. Representatives from every nation would serve on its governing board. Any use of the device would require unanimous consent from all members. Strict protocols would define exactly when activation was permitted, limiting it to extinction-level threats that left no other option. The technology itself would be studied and understood, but it would never be weaponized for conquest or aggression. Others spoke with different views. Some argued that the device should be destroyed before it could corrupt future generations. They pointed to human history and asked how long it would be before some ambitious leader decided that the oversight rules no longer applied to them. Others wanted the technology shared openly with all species, believing that mutual deterrence might prevent anyone from using it at all. The debate lasted for 3 days. People argued and compromised and argued some more. The crowds outside grew larger as word spread that the vote was approaching. Some protesters demanded that the Fold engine be used to secure human dominance over the galaxy. Others carried signs calling for its immediate destruction. The world was divided in ways that felt impossible to bridge. On the morning of the 4th day, the vote was called. The proposal was Park's framework with modifications suggested by dozens of different delegations. The Architects Trust would have permanent headquarters on the Moon, far enough from Earth to require serious commitment from anyone who wanted to access it. Observer status would eventually be offered to non-hostile alien species, including the Dominion. The Fold engine would remain dormant unless activated by unanimous vote in response to an existential threat. The results came in slowly as each delegation recorded their position. The final tally showed a narrow majority in favor of the proposal. Humanity had chosen restraint. Admiral Lane transmitted the decision to the Dominion fleet waiting at the border. She explained the framework and the oversight mechanisms, and the commitment to never use the Fold engine for offensive purposes. She invited Ambassador to serve as the first alien observer on the Architects Trust governing board. The response came within hours. The Dominion accepted the terms and began withdrawing their fleet, sent a personal message to Lane expressing something that seemed almost like admiration. He had expected humans to use their newfound power immediately. He had expected them to demand concessions and territory and tribute. Instead, they had chosen limits. They had built walls around their own strength. He told her that his people would be watching closely. If humanity kept their word, the Dominion might eventually become something other than a reluctant neighbor. If they broke their promise, the consequences would be swift and absolute. Lane accepted both the warning and the possibility of a better future. The USS Meridian was decommissioned, and transformed into a museum ship orbiting Earth. The strange patterns on its hull were preserved exactly as they had been when the vessel returned from its 12-year journey. Visitors came from around the world to walk its corridors and read the names of those who had not survived. The ship became a monument to sacrifice and responsibility and the burden of carrying impossible choices. Captain Daniel Hayes retired to a small coastal town where he could watch the ocean and remember the ones who did not make it home. Commander Morgan visited him often, and they sat on his porch and talked about the old days and the hard decisions, and the hope that humanity would prove worthy of the trust they had received. Sometimes they did not talk at all. They just watched the waves and let the silence speak for itself. The Architect's Trust began its work quietly and carefully. Scientists studied the fold engine and tried to understand its principles without activating it. Diplomats negotiated protocols and emergency procedures. Representatives from 100 nations learned to work together toward a common goal. Years passed. The Dominion remained at peace with humanity. Other species reached out, curious about the strange creatures who had found the Architect's legacy and chosen not to use it. Earth became known throughout the galaxy as something unusual, a young species that had been handed the power of gods and decided to set it aside. A generation later, a young cadet visited the Meridian Museum as part of her training. She walked through the corridors where history had been made and stopped in front of the crystal interface that had once controlled the fold engine. The device itself had been moved to the Trust headquarters on the Moon, but the interface remained as a reminder of what humanity had chosen. She reached out and touched the cold crystal. It hummed faintly against her fingers, vibrating with energy that came from somewhere beyond normal space. The geometric patterns seemed to shift and flow in the corner of her vision. She wondered what humanity would do with its second chance. She wondered if the architects had ever stood in a moment like this, full of hope and possibility, and the knowledge that everything could still go wrong. The stars waited outside the viewport, patient and ancient and full of mysteries that no species had ever solved. Humanity had earned the right to try.